So we are
Can
live. Yes.
Okay.
Please go on, Laurie. We had a little pause.
All right. Well, I'm not quite sure where I left off, but I will just pick up from my last point, I guess. Shall I? Let me share my screen.
Yes, can you share? Okay.
Yes. Okay, thank you everyone for waiting. We had some technical difficulties, but we are back online. So I want to talk a little bit about receiving country bias, which is one of 4 types of bias that I'm going to be discussing today. One is that is when the situation in northern destination countries is really the starting point, and in some cases the ending point, neglecting perspectives of origin and transit countries, and really narratives of migrants themselves. According to Carling and Castles, this is absolutely not surprising, given that research funding and capacities are concentrated in the North. And we can also see an empirical basis for this in this graph here, which is provided to us by UNDESA in 2019. It's true that of destination countries, the 3 that I focus on, the US, UK, and Australia, are indeed very highly represented destination countries. They do not appear as much in origin countries. And I think that that's important to understand. The exception, of course, being the UK. So the UK sends a lot of people abroad, but it also receives a lot of people. The other type of bias that I want to talk about is migration researcher bias. This is something that we need to kind of sit with and be honest with ourselves about what this could mean. Most published and well-regarded migration researchers are predominantly based in North America and Europe, and the few that are based in Asia are in countries of immigration. So as an example, according to Compass Institute at Oxford, which is a very well-regarded migration institute, we have these 4 highly ranked migration studies journals. And you can see that I've broken down the region of editorial board member affiliation. Most of these are based in Europe. Most board members, maybe they are not European nationals, but the institutes or institutions that they're affiliated with are based in Europe, followed by North America. And these journals themselves, these highly ranked journals, are based in the UK and the USA. We can see that barely any South American board members are present, barely any Middle Eastern board members are present, and barely any African board members are present. We have a little bit better representation in Oceania, primarily from Australia, and in one case New Zealand, in one case Fiji. And then we have a few in Asia. Sort of significantly, the same 2 female Asian academics are board members at 3 out of these 4. So this is very important for representation and having perspectives of people who can really understand deeply through lived experience what these narratives mean. I think that migration research needs to always make a commitment to be inclusive. And part of that is making sure that the people who are deciding what research is pertinent also make sure to mirror that principle. Power asymmetry bias is another type of research that we can talk about. Majority of migration studies tend to focus on the movement of peoples from less developed countries of origin with a lower quality of life and opportunity to destinations with a higher quality of life and opportunity. You can see here in the graph, we have most migration happening to high-income countries by far. But between 2013 and 2017, you can see that we're having more migration occur to upper middle income countries, and we've actually had a decrease to high income countries, although it still remains far and away the majority. But this power asymmetry bias continues to reinforce a narrow view of involuntary push and pull factors of course migrants will go to a place that has more opportunity. That's the thinking. It fails to explain migration in terms of elective mobility. And in my case, I study highly skilled migration or global talent. What about the people who have choices? They're not passive necessarily subjects of these push and pull factors. They're making choices, and we need to know why. Lastly, the fourth type of bias I want to highlight today is the bias of the majority. It's important to kind of sit with this because although we can say that the power asymmetry and migration patterns highlighted in the three previous types of bias are all true, they're not true for everyone. And the politicized image of the needy migrant has been used to justify protectionist politics that limit beneficial inclusion policies on the ground. By studying the narratives, social structures, and contributions of elective expatriates or elective migrants, including global talent, we can make a movement toward a more accurate and fair representation of migrants. And I would encourage any of you who are thinking about your next project, please try to find a minority narrative so that we can look in different ways to disrupt bias and create a more inclusive narrative and ongoing discourse on migration. I just want to add a little bit of something regarding majority bias that's pertinent to Asia, which is the region that I look at. You can see that here in the leftmost column, we have migrants to Asia. It's very low, actually. Migrants within Asia is very high. Migrants from Asia is kind of in the middle. So this is saying that within Asia, Asian migrants are the predominant discourse. They're the bias in the majority. So when people talk about migration in Asia as a region, they're talking about inter-Asian migration. It's a very rare thing for someone to deeply examine why someone from abroad, especially a typically destination country like the UK, America, or Australia, why would they go to an Asian country? This is an underexplored narrative, but it can teach us a lot. So underlying my goal in my research, and what I would encourage you to think of as well, is the Global Compact on Migration, which some of you may know is a wonderful document. It's the first document put out that takes a holistic view on migration in the UN. Objective 17 is to eliminate all forms of discrimination and promote evidence-based public discourse to shape perceptions of migration. So how can we go about doing that? One of the ways is to create more narratives that can provide a more true picture of what different types of lived migration experiences are like. And in some cases, that means disrupting certain types of categories and definitions that we have. So what is global talent? I argue that global talent are elective migrants, and they're legally working adults that have undertaken an international relocation to achieve certain career goals. The idea with global talent is that these are usually temporary goals. And the assumption is that after completing the career goal, the global talent, the elective migrant, and any dependents will go back to their country of origin or move on to another country. Then what is an immigrant? Well, an immigrant tends to be defined more as a person moving for good. And actually, research on global talent or expatriates tends to focus on recruitment practices because of this assumption. Overcoming barriers to integration with their local colleagues, and maybe other processes of adjustment for the worker and his or her family after moving abroad. And while these are practical points, they reduce the global talent or expatriate to the professional function that he or she may perform in their job. And it really minimizes the psychosocial inquiry into expatriate identity and society. In contrast, research on migration as a whole encapsulates a much broader range of issues with significant focus on models of integration. And this is most certainly true of studies on immigration. So consequently, we find that there's not really so complete a picture. We have a gap in the research. The motivation and experience of an expatriate choosing to remain living and working abroad in the same location in the longer term, essentially becoming an immigrant, is an underexplored but important topic. So I want to just kind of demonstrate that a little bit more. The timeline of factors explored in mobility and integration research on expatriates tends to not include narratives before or after the assignment abroad. It's confined to the assignment from recruitment, contract and benefits, relocation services, and then transition, which includes a lot of these different types of elements. Ultimately, the goal of all of this is the successful performance of the work and completion of the contract. There's not a lot going on after. What happens after that initial time horizon is completed? In addition, we can see that mobility and integration research on expatriates focuses on these different narratives. Most intimately is the individual global talent themselves. How are they dealing with these stresses? How are they adapting? How are they performing their job? What kind of motivators do they take in order to do their work or take the contract? Then, by extension, in the cases where they're accompanied by family, there are considerations for expatriate family. How do children adapt or adjust to this mobility? And then how do the global talent interact with their employer? There is also a few studies about how expatriates or global talent interact with the host nation society, but these are very few and far between. My research suggests that there's an interim group here, another level of interaction, and that is with the expatriate society itself. And although this is not something that's a novel concept, it is only important so far as we're considering global talent. And that's because global talent research is reductionist and it puts them here. So we actually are able to paint a more human picture of these elective, highly skilled migrants through considering them in terms of immigration narratives. So in my research, I examined 15 different models of cultural inclusion, and they all kind of fall short. These are the ones that I examined, and these are very common. Maybe some of you are familiar, I'm sure you are, but they fell short for three primary reasons. The first is that the identities and relationships of the parties involved didn't reflect what I found. They tend to be based on the notion that the host nation, culture or society, and the migrants are the two parties interacting. And this was not the case of the group that I studied. It was the migrant or the global talent, and then the expatriate society or group of migrants. In addition, the stability and sustainability of the interaction. Most of these integration models presume a sustained interaction and a stability of community to a certain degree. But expatriate societies are highly mobile, highly volatile. People are always coming and going and transient. And yet, they're able to form a certain degree of social cohesion. So this is also disrupting these narratives. Lastly, the power asymmetry dynamic. Migration is not really presumed to be elective in the main. Migrants are presumed to be of lower socioeconomic status and thereby pulled to countries or destinations of higher socioeconomic opportunity. And that's not the case of the people that I studied. So what was exactly going on? And how do I make these categorizations? This is the HDI ranking, the Human Development Index. Since we're studying people, looking only at GDP really is not the best way to evaluate the lived experience in different countries. So these are some different comparisons between these Asian megacities or countries such as Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore, highly developed, and also the migrant origin countries. So I've kind of done a bit of an inversion here because I'm considering Australians, British, and Americans as migrant origin countries, when in normal discourse, these are predominantly destination countries. But in this study, we're looking at these Asian places as being the destination countries. And this gives us a valuable minority narrative because we can see through these metrics that the level of development is actually comparable between these places, meaning that we're not seeing a power asymmetry mobility, we're seeing a more lateral or horizontal mobility. So what's making them go? So I was looking at primarily these three questions. I want to know What motivates global talent to transition from a short-term employment contract holder driven primarily by a specific career goal abroad to an immigrant with a desire to remain in Singapore in the longer term, and with a particular focus on the role of belonging in that motivation and the role of attaining permanent residency as an outward manifestation of that motivation. So I explored the sense of belonging and motivations of American, Australian, and British expatriates to remain in Singapore in the long term. And I used a social structuralist lens. And through this approach, I argue that the phenomenology of expatriate society exhibits traits of an autopoietic social structure. So in the case of American, Australian, and British elective diaspora in Singapore, how significant is this group? Well, you can see here, maybe you can see, I see that it's a bit blurry, sorry about that, but foreign nationals or permanent residents plus non-residents, non-Singaporean citizens make up approximately 40% of Singapore's total population. This is a bit unique to have such a high representation of migrant workers or foreign workers. So I examined employment pass holders, dependent pass holders, and permanent residents. The reason I looked at these groups is because these statuses confer with them a high degree of skill and typically pretty high degree of financial compensation, which is a great way of categorizing them as global talent. So who exactly did I talk to? Well, this is a breakdown of the demographics of the people I spoke with by nationality, sex, visa status, ethnicity, age range, and household income. So I tried my best to get a little bit of everyone. Especially elusive was the male dependent. They're very difficult to find, but I did manage to find a few. Their narratives were particularly distinctive. Another interesting narrative that came forward that was distinctive was Asian people of Asian ethnicity who were actually American, British, or Australian nationals. Because they were migrating to an Asian country, they had to contend with sort of mistaken identity. People expected them to behave as though they were an Asian migrant, but in fact, they carried the cultural background and social norms from the US or the UK or Australia, and this presented for them some challenges that were a bit unique. So I want to say a little bit here about why I chose Singapore. Firstly, it has a unique history and policies that make it especially competitive for global business and global talent. It's also because I have significant participant observation from my time living there. I was living there for 4 years. So my connections to Singapore enabled me to source my interviewees using a purposive sampling method. So typically global talent are not necessarily easy to find. So I was able to find them through my previous connections. My research methods were in part inspired by a previous study in 1992 called Americans Abroad, Comparative Study of Immigrants from the United States by Diaspora, which was also released in second edition with some updates in early 2020. I employed mixed methods, just like Diaspora, combining quantitative survey data with qualitative interview data. And I also used life mapping, which was a great way to gather a pretty great degree of biographical data in a relatively short amount of time. I focus only on business expatriates. However, I don't include missionaries or military people, only business expatriates. And I was able to collect significant insights from the autobiographical representations and interviews. So these people, as we discussed, are pretty prevalent in Singapore. And I managed to talk with a great deal of them and for diversity. I just want to say a few words here about their sense of belonging. 18% of Singapore's population is composed of PR, EP, and DP holders. So this is an important figure for us to keep in mind. That's nearly 20% of the total population are global talent by my definition. So it's reasonable to assume that not only Are these people a significant part of the labor market? They're a significant part of the consumer market and services market. So a lot of Singapore is actually run by expatriates for expatriates. And so it's reasonable to assume that you can have actually a little society of migrants that help govern societies of migrants. They cater to each other and they provide services to each other. This might be one of the only places in the world that has such a high level of global talent at such a predominant rate in their society. Importantly, though, the people I interviewed, over 50% indicated that the majority of their close friends and contacts in Singapore were from the UK, USA, and Australia. So that means that most of their daily interpersonal interactions are with expatriates. Another common theme was disassociation of the sense of belonging from Singapore as a location. Rather, belonging was rooted in the participatory relationships. And this is going back to that theoretical model of social structuralism. You can see here what that disassociation looks like. As one British expatriate said in Singapore, "So I had Philippine friends in Holland, but it was much harder to make Bolivian friends in Bolivia," talking about the commonality of disassociation that's so important in forming expatriate society. Another thing to mention is about the personal financial income range. And this has to do with the ability of people to value different kinds of qualities about living in Singapore. And interviewees earning over $500,000 per year, Sing dollars that is, said that they value ability to develop connections with local people and opportunity to experience Singapore culture far less than participants in other lower income categories. And the value of open and friendly community consistently decreases as income increases. This might be because the expatriate world becomes more insular the longer people are there, and also with the more money that they have as they progress through their careers. We also see here that more people apply for permanent residency as their income increases. This has to do with probably a combination of factors, such as they feel a higher sense of belonging, but also there are some benefits to applying for permanent residency. So I spoke before about my theoretical structuring, this autopoietic social structure. This is from a German theorist called Niklas Luhmann. And it's a way of considering social cohesion despite a high degree of transience and diverse cultural coding. So basically autopoietic means it's self-perpetuating and self-sustaining. And that means that once you enter this society through an interpenetration point, you mainly stay within the society, aside from structural coupling points for operational or transactional interactions. So for example, even though you are a global talent, maybe you still need to go to the bank, you still need to go to the post office, you still need to go to the grocery store in some cases. So you do interact with Singaporean society, but those are just transactions. None of the people I spoke to, unless they were married to a Singaporean, none of the people I spoke to said that they had very meaningful interactions or really any interactions at all with Singaporeans. Because of the high degree of expatriates, they could sustain their daily lives completely just by interacting with other expatriates. What's interesting about that is that it was a significant enough sense of belonging to justify them or motivate them to remain in Singapore for the longer term, and in some cases to actually immigrate, to take on permanent residency, or even to seek out citizenship in some cases. So this, again, going back to what we talked about before, this disrupts the bias narratives of migration and existing models of integration. And this is what we can learn from global talent narratives in terms of greater application to migration studies. It's, again, emphasizing that you can help create a better picture of the bias by sharing narratives from a minority, even if it's a minority like global talent that some might argue doesn't qualify as a migrant and certainly would not be considered to be a vulnerable group. Yet I say that there's something to be learned from them, And it's a valuable lesson in terms of keeping us on our toes and not just accepting current integration models. So that is actually the end of my presentation. Thank you. And I'd like to open the floor to questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Laurie. So before everyone else, can I do a question for you?
Você pode me ouvir, Felipe?
Sim, posso sim. Can I do a question?
Eu não estou te ouvindo, só um minutinho. Peraí, deixa eu ver se agora vai funcionar.
Are you listening?
Tá me ouvindo, Felipe?
Estou sim. Vocês estão me ouvindo?
Eu não estou te ouvindo. Pode falar?
Sorry, I couldn't
Não
hear you.
estou ouvindo vocês. Só um segundo.
Now you can hear me, Laurie?
Now I can hear you. Somehow I couldn't hear you, but now I can. Go ahead.
Okay. Can I do a question before anyone else?
Please go ahead.
Olha, eu peço, I apologize, but I'm having some technical problems here. I can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. I have some questions. Sorry. I'm going to make my questions, and then while you are answering to them, I will try to fix the problem because I'm not listening to your answers now. So thank you so much for your presentation. I was very impressed by the fact that you were questioning the traditional bias of the migration explanations as always as poor people trying to find better resources in other countries. And I agree totally with you because in many studies that we have done here, we could find out different situations in which people can migrate. Like one very special situation that I've studied is very similar to the one that you found there, which was the Brazilian businessman that migrated to the South Florida. So that breaks all the idea that all the Brazilians that go to other countries, they try they go because they are in a bad economical situation or something like that. So one thing that I found out that I would like to hear from you, if you find something, if you have some information different from this one, or if you found out something similar, it was that the Brazilians there, they refuse the identity of migrants, you know, immigrants or migrants. They say they are, as the words that you use it here, they say they are expatriates. So probably they use in my, you know, my idea is that they use that as a way of separate themselves of the other Brazilians, as you know, in a probably in a social status separation. So despite they sometimes share some characteristics with them, some like places to go and some special identities there, they still try to separate themselves from the other immigrants. Let me see here if I have other questions from people, because I have some questions for you. Okay. And the other question that I would like to ask you, I will wait for people to put some other questions here. The other question that I had for you was about your interviews. So you told, I think you did open interviews, and what kind of question you would make while we were interviewing people. And if when they were answering these questions, if they were comfortable enough to talk about their career. You also mentioned about their level of wage, salaries. So how did you get those informations, and how it was interviewing those people? Because from my experience, these specialized people, they don't, when they tell about their migration stories, they are very restricted to the business experience. So they don't want to, they avoid talking about their immigrant experience, their personal experience in their other countries. So I would like to listen to you about this experience doing interviews with this kind of people. And also, you mentioned this, I'm not very familiarized with this Asian migration. So you were saying that usually people understand that the migration, this huge migration in Asia as an internal movement, but you found out people coming from other countries outside Asia. So I would like you, if you have some time, to tell a little bit more about this intermigration in Asia, how you know, what kind of movements you see there, which one are the most important, and how this global talent migration is inserted in this internal migration in Asia, and also this migration that comes from outside Asia. So I will let you to answer these questions, and then I will check here if people have more questions after your answer, okay? Thank you so much for being here. Sorry for my technical problems, and I would like to take this few minutes to say that we are very happy to have you here. Thank you so much for your presentation. Wow.
Thank you so much. I'd like to address your questions, and I hope that you can hear my answers. But anyway, so to address your first question about this terminology, why expatriate, why migrant? The truth is that migration is a quite old concept. It's been around since people have been around. But this expatriate term is relatively new. So what is the difference? Why has this differentiation emerged? Expatriates are typically tied to a particular global commerce pull factor or push factor. So these are people who are typically employed at a global company, and as a generalization. In some cases, they can work in other sectors. Like some people might argue that people who work in international organizations or people who work in government are also highly skilled. And so they should also perhaps be considered expatriates. I just didn't interview any of those people. In my work, I focused on business migrants, highly skilled business migrants who do, as you said, identify themselves as expatriates. And I think that they are not necessarily choosing to do this as a point of pride or as a point to specifically disassociate themselves from an image. They might simply be informed by their communities that they're moving into. They may think, wow, I'm moving abroad. And when they show up, someone says, oh, you're an expatriate now. And then they may take that on as part of their identity. But in my view, this is actually a somewhat problematic distinction because it's a type of hierarchy that's really artificial. And I'm really not sure that it benefits people, or at least it doesn't benefit vulnerable migrants. Mainly, I think this distinction benefits companies that tend to want to hire global talent or expatriates, because typically highly skilled migrant visas don't have as much scrutiny in some cases as other types of visas. It depends on the country, but typically expatriate visas or highly skilled worker visas in Singapore, it produces an employment pass. In some cases, when you earn above a certain amount per month, you can apply for a personal employment pass, which is a PEP. People who are highly skilled migrants have the option to apply for permanent residency. They have a lot of benefits. People on other types of employment visas in Singapore might face certain types of restrictions. Like they may have restricted mobility. They may have restricted choice of housing. These types of things are hierarchies that exist in a lot of different places around the world. But I think that that distinction is primarily for visa categories. I don't think that it's always a matter of the expatriate themselves trying to put themselves above their fellow migrants. I think that this is a systemic issue, and it's a systemically problematic distinction, potentially, for if we're talking about things from a human rights standpoint or a humanitarian lens, if you're trying to reach out to the vulnerable. So that's what I would say about that question. Regarding how I did my interviews, so I did a 3-part interview, and each one of them lasted about 2 hours. So it was quite a lot of field work. And I did a survey. So the survey was how I collected data on things like income and about how many family members they had living with them in Singapore versus outside of Singapore, for example. I asked them a bunch of questions in survey. And some of those questions I specifically asked in survey because I thought that they might feel uncomfortable saying it directly to my face in interview, which you can always ask somebody to do a survey first. If they mark an answer, you can come back to that and do a follow-up question in semi-structured interview. And then they can explain why they've marked that answer. And that's often an easier way to transition into an uncomfortable or more sensitive personal question. The third part of my interview, so survey, semi-structured interview, the third part was life mapping. So life mapping is where you take basically a blank piece of paper and you just ask someone to please draw your life on this paper. And there's many different types of forms of a life that people would draw. But it's a way of collecting a relatively informative and intricate type of biographical information relatively quickly. It took people between 5 and 20 minutes to draw their lives on a piece of paper for me, which enabled me to have a reference point to go back and ask them why they had placed Singapore and their movement to Singapore on their map in the way that they did. Some people had moved, often people had moved many times before coming to Singapore. And so in some cases, there was an embedded comparison in the way that they regarded Singapore that was built into that life map illustration. And that was a very informative point for guiding the interview conversation and trying to understand their sense of belonging and what factors affected that compared to where they had been previously. You asked if they felt comfortable talking about their personal experience. I would say that they felt very comfortable. Often we met at a cafe. In some cases, I was invited into people's homes. In a few cases, I met them at their office in a conference room. I mean, these were often people that I knew personally because I had lived in Singapore for 4 years. or they were people who were referred to me by people that I knew personally. So because there was a bit of this personal connection and identification, and also I was there for 4 years, so I know this type of society. I have a lot of commonality with these people in terms of reference points, in terms of being able to relate to them. I know we know the same people, we like the same food, you know, we're in this beautiful cafe that I've been to 5 times before. You can put people at ease. And so people did talk to me about their families, about the difficulties and challenges that they had. And in my experience, they really appreciated someone asking about the more human side of their migration. As I mentioned in this presentation, that's often not something that's really considered for the expatriate. They tend to be reduced down to the job and very little else. If there are personal considerations, it tends to be about the transition into doing the job well. How well are you adjusting to this culture? Because you have a job to do. You know, is your family adjusting well to this new environment? Because we know from research, if they don't adjust well, you may terminate your contract early. By asking them more reflective and personal questions without this goal of understanding their job, I think that they appreciated actually having an open mind and an open ear to have that side of their narrative. Lastly, you asked about intermigration in Asia, which types of migration was important, and are there global talent in Asia? Absolutely, there are global talent within Asia, and the majority of global talent in Singapore is from other Asian cities, other Asian countries, not from the UK, the US, or Australia. So in terms of demographics, again, the group I studied was very much a minority narrative, even among global talent in Singapore. You know, I think we need to discuss much more, in fact, what it means to see a rise in the ranks of Asian universities and institutes. We're getting better qualifications and better, more educated populations in Asian countries that are very competitive with the typical global talent that comes from places like the UK, America, and Australia. And I think that that's wonderful to see that diversity. And I think that our notion of what an expat is, or what a global talent is certainly determined. It certainly will become more determined, I hope, by the type of narratives that we can collect from Asian global talent. But yes, there's a lot of mobilities in Asia that are very fascinating to observe. I don't think that we can say that the majority of Asian mobilities are for global talent, but then again, that's not true of anywhere in the world. So that's what I would say about that. Thank you for your questions. Are there any other questions?
Valeria is having some issues with the sound and so on. But I would like to make one question, Lauren, for you. Are you listening to me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Usually with former colonies and former metropolis, we see after the independence process, a migratory relationship between them, like Algeria and France, India and the UK, and so on. Could you somehow feel this kind of relation between British in Singapore, because Singapore is a former British colony? This kind of relation exists in the case of British migrating to Singapore.
Okay, I'll respond to that. I would say I agree with you, absolutely, that is a factor. But I found that to be a factor much more in the social cohesiveness of the Australian American and British expatriates that I spoke with. As you know, Australia and the US were also both former British colonies. And actually, in terms of timeline, they were colonies much longer. And I think that the narratives that define and cultural norms that tend to remain more prevalent there, especially they're all as well, English-speaking countries as a native language. Of course, Singapore also has English as one of its 4 mother tongues. But I think that, what I was seeing when I did my research about belonging and about social cohesion was these 3 groups in particular had a predominant commonality, and it was not intentional. It was something that they seemed very surprised to admit during interview. So I think that this is important as well to kind of sit with that, sometimes some of the most powerful integration is involuntary. It happens naturally. People are drawn to each other through commonality. It's not that these people intentionally excluded Singapore, they're Singaporean people, but rather that perhaps they just naturally found themselves drawn to to their fellow migrants from these places. In terms of Singaporean society and these expatriates that I talked to, although I think that you're right to some degree, surely there might be some commonality, and we do see some interesting cultural trends that were remaining. For example, Singapore has some very interesting combination of British architecture and Asian architecture, or British food and Asian food, is uniquely Singaporean dishes. And that's very fun to explore. But I think that since Singapore's founding, which was only about 55 years ago, it's done such a great job of creating its own national identity, which is absolutely remarkable. And I would say that they celebrate that identity very much, and that although they appreciate their legacy, they don't necessarily feel constrained by their identity as a former British colony, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm back, sorry. I had some problems here, but I got to use the other computer. Sorry, Felipe, I'm back. Did you see the question here on the chat, Felipe?
Yes. Lauren, we have a question from the audience. Hugo Mansour asked if you found any Brazilian in this kind of migratory conditions, which can be similar. No, sorry. That could be assimilated as nations brought in the world.
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear you.
Hugo Mansour asked if you found any Brazilian in these conditions which could assimilate with the nations brought in the work. Does it make sense?
Yeah, maybe.
In your
Maybe.
word.
Yeah.
So you're asking, did I find any Brazilian communities that
similar situations to the other
that you have
to the other?
Yeah. In Singapore?
Yes.
I do know of some Brazilian expatriates in Singapore who would fit very similar profiles of the people that I spoke with. Absolutely. But there were a few reasons why I didn't necessarily interview these types of people. My assumption is that most people in Brazil may not have English as their native language or their mother tongue. And secondly, it was also my assumption that the types of immigration pathways that happen from Brazil to Singapore are much less well established in terms of the number of people coming in and the number of companies that are actively recruiting from Brazil compared to the companies that have recruitment pathways set up in the UK and the US and Australia for Singapore. So that's those are two reasons why I didn't look further at the Brazilian community in Singapore. Another reason is because Brazil was not a former British colony, so I tried to make some. Of course, in my work, this is more described than I did in this presentation. But of course, as Felipe said, there's some kind of commonality that is occurring between Australians and Americans and British because of this shared history, shared legacy, and to some degree, perhaps we might even say shared identity. So, and this was certainly reflected in the social cohesion that I observed through interview. I would be interested actually to know more about the Brazilian community in Singapore. I also do research in Japan, and we have a very significant Brazilian community here in Japan called the Nikkei. And that is, I think, something I would be interested to know more of. How does this Nikkei community influence some kind of Brazilian pull factor for the recruitment of expatriates from Brazil to Japan? So that could be another project for another time. But thank you for your question.
Okay.
Laurie, it would be very nice if you studied this special Brazilian community in Japan, because there are many studies already about Brazilians in Japan, because they are the largest immigrant community there, and also because it's a very, probably, I think it's the third largest immigration movement outside Brazil. And you know, typically Brazilians go to Japan to work in hard work. You know, they are going to work in as blue collar workers. And it would be very interesting to understand how these specialized high income workers, Brazilian workers in Japan, break with this stereotype. So it would be very nice if you could also to approach this community. I haven't heard about Brazilians in Singapore, but it's very interesting that you mentioned that you heard about that. So I'm going to try to know a little bit more about that.
Well, I do know some of them personally, just from social circles, but I didn't do interviews with them, so I don't know why are they there, what is their job. I don't know this kind of thing, because you don't ask people this kind of thing socially. But I think that it would be very interesting to study the Nikkei communities compared with any Brazilian expatriates, because it's very difficult in some cases for the Brazilian Nikkei to have economic mobility in Japan. It can be quite challenging. So I think that if we can see some connection between expatriates and resident Nikkei, can there be some kind of community building or capacity building that could benefit both communities? That would be something wonderful to see. So thank you so much for your encouragement.
Yeah, and also because this Brazilian community in Japan, they have a special visa, you know, so it's very different from other Brazilian immigration to other countries, like in Japan, because most of them they come from Japanese background in Brazil. So they have this special visa for 3 years. All Brazilians that are in Japan, all of them are documented, except, you know, it's very rare to find some of them that they are not documented, because there is this agreement between both countries. But when you know, they have this special visa as a, you know, temporary workers, but they, you know, they get to renovate the visas, and they some of them, they are there more than 20 years, and some of them go to, you know, to get new kind of visas. But it's a very special kind of immigration from Brazil to other countries. So probably you would be very interested. And it's such a large community there that you would be impressed that around Tóquio and other industrial cities in Japan, they have like the whole neighborhoods only lived by Brazilians, you know. So it's very, very special immigration.
I would love to explore that one more. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the interest. Maybe I can find some article on Brazilian immigration to Japan in English, and I can send you. I will try to find some article or maybe a book, and I can send you this reference, and maybe you can be more interested in working with this immigration.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have another question from the audience. Guilherme is asking you, Lauren, if you did some kind of research about other former communities from other communities from other former British colonies living in Singapore.
So far, I haven't. It was originally my plan to do a comparative study between this same group of people in Singapore, so Australian, American, and British expatriates in Singapore, and then to do a comparative study with Hong Kong, and then to do an additional comparative study with Tokyo. These are three relatively different situations. Hong Kong and Singapore are more similar than Tokyo in this sense that both Hong Kong and Singapore were former British colonies. However, Hong Kong, more than Singapore, I think has it has fewer expatriates in terms of the representation of overall population. And I think that we can probably anticipate that there may be some sort of threshold at which point we can see that autopoietic social structuralism is possible for the expatriate, meaning that the expatriate society has the capacity to sustain and perpetuate itself as it does in Singapore, according to my research. And so I think that in Japan, however, by contrast, we have approximately 2% of the overall population is non-Japanese. That's it. So it's much, much lower compared with nearly 40% in Singapore. Nearly 20% of Singaporean foreign workers are permanent residents, EPs, or DPs. So permanent residents, employment pass holders, or dependents of permanent residents or employment pass holders. So comparing that to all types of immigrants and foreign workers in Japan are around 2%. So in Japan, it's very interesting to try and consider to what extent can such people really sustain themselves. They are forced, because of less density, if anything else, to interact a lot more with Japanese society. So how does this affect their sense of identity and belonging and the ease of integration for them? So this is an ongoing study that I'm doing right now. It was quite honestly slowed down by COVID. It's very difficult to go out and meet with people naturally. So digital data collection under these circumstances has been quite a challenge. And I would argue that any kind of integration or social inclusion during COVID has been compromised compared to pre-COVID days. We are all so isolated these days. It's very difficult to do a comparative study, not only between two different countries, but also pre-COVID and post-COVID timeline. So I think that in some sense, it might be worthwhile to revisit my study in Singapore post-COVID and compare it to the pre-COVID results, which is what I presented to you all today. So I think that there's a lot of different benefits to a comparative study. But in answer to the question, I haven't done a comparative study of this group with other former British colonies for social cohesion comparison. No, I have not. Interesting ideas, though.
So, Lauren, people here are thanking you for your presentation. So, Felipe, do you have any more questions? I think there in Japan is very late, probably.
Yes, no, I just would like to say thank you, Lauren. Thank you for accepting my invitation. It was very interesting, your speech here today. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me. It was a delight, and it was also my first time to present to a primarily Brazilian audience. So thank you for that wonderful experience. Thank you for your questions, and it's been wonderful to be able to share my research. I wish you all good health and safety during these times, and hope to remain in touch with this wonderful community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentation. I hope you can keep in touch, exchanging research experiences. We are available for everything that you need. And we are testing for the first time this resource of transmitting by Facebook. I had some technical problems, but I see that the other people didn't, so I think it was very good. And I hope the transmission is going to stay available on our Facebook page. So I will let you know if it's still there, but I think we can keep there, so other people can also watch your presentation later, okay?
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is definitely a benefit of COVID and digital conferences.
Yes, we are trying to learn how to deal with that, but it's going, I think, pretty well. Thank you so much. We enjoyed your presence here, and have a wonderful night. Thank you for everybody. Muito obrigada a todos que estiveram presentes. Desculpem os problemas técnicos. O GPOM, então, tem aí mais algumas sessões de discussão hoje desse evento, Migrações e Deslocamentos. Amanhã também temos 2 mesas e na quarta temos 2 mesas. Muito obrigada. Obrigada, Felipe. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.